licenses of water companies if their firms are found to have polluted rivers and seas with illegal sewage spills. The exact criteria for a ban will be decided after a consultation. Alzheimer's charities have warned that patients who could benefit from two new drugs may lose out because the NHS isn't ready to make the best use of them. Lecanemab and donanemab, which slow the cognitive decline caused by the disease, are expected to be licensed within months. And the men's marathon world record holder, Colby Two, has died in a car crash in his home country of Kenya. The 24-year-old set the world record in the Chicago Marathon last October with a winning time of 2 minutes and 41 seconds. BBC News.
We've got a new book of the week for you this morning on BBC Radio 4. Today telling the true story of the wildfire that ripped through the hub of the Canadian oil industry. The winner of the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction, Fire Weather by John Valiant, explores the intertwined histories of fire, the oil business and climate science. And it starts in 45 minutes after Start the Week with Kirsty Walker.
Hello. Today a thrilling journey across continents and through history to dispel ideas and myths about how the West was made. Ancient Rome and Greece were only a tiny part of the jigsaw that is human civilization, rather. The West was created out of global encounters, from alphabets to amber bead sales to Sanskrit, elephants to epic poems. And our guests are all dealing in blockbusters. Josephine Quinn is Professor of Ancient History at Oxford University, and her new book, How the World Made the West, goes back a mere 400,000 years. The Roman artifact specialist Carolina Rangel de Lima has co-curated Legion, the latest exhibition at the British Museum, which tells the story of the life of a Roman legionary, soldiers who were Egyptians, Syrians, Germans, even Brits, in the machine that allowed Rome to master this vast empire. And in his new book, The Light of Asia, the historian Christopher Harding explores the West's fascination, sometimes obsession, with Asia since antiquity. The Jesuits, the Beat Generation, took Gwyneth Paltrow. Hello, everybody. Josephine, first of all, how the world made the West. I mean, your argument in this book so strongly is time for a reset.
That's right. I started writing this book as a classics professor, wanting to reset the idea of Greece and Rome in the history of Western civilization, not least because I was reading in Greek and Roman authors, much bigger, interesting stories, wider ranging. But as I was actually writing it, what I came to realise was that what we really need to reset is the idea of civilization itself, and in particular the idea of discrete civilizations that emerge, flourish and decline, but do so sort of largely alone. And that's just not the way humans work. History happens through connections and relationships and journeys. Trade, sex and war, those were my triumvirate of ideas.
I think trade, sex and war is a very good way to start on a Monday morning. Yeah, this is a great story of migration, mixing, mobility. There's lots of things here. And I love the fact that you kind of describe a lot of this through artifacts as well, which is a running story that was almost going to come to Legion.
Makes such an extraordinary difference in the history of the whole world, and it's not one of those things that's existed forever. It had to be invented, and it was invented in the Nile, not even in Egypt, but in what's now Sudan, as far as we can tell. First images we have of sailing ships from now Sudan. It takes us about 3,000 BCE. By about 2,500 BCE, Egyptians are managing to sail ships Mediterranean Sea, just the river, but into the sea, which was much more difficult, round to the land, to ports like Byblos, Tyre, and so on. And then another 500 years later again, people from Byblos finally managed to sail across the open sea and against the huge westerly winds of the Mediterranean, and actually reach, as far as we can tell, the first place they reached is west of the Levantine coast, in the island of Crete. And
which becomes so pivotal.
Completely pivotal. You suddenly see the wheel appears on Crete. the donkey, human making, suddenly becomes much more sophisticated. It changes life on Crete. Villages become cities. People start to write things down. It makes an amazing difference. But the huge difference it makes in the history of the world is that until that moment, Europe was this very marginal, peripheral area of the world. It was kind of intermittently in touch, you know, through canoes and so on, with where things were really kind of going on with the big kingdoms and empires. But after sailing starts, it just is so much faster. It goes much further. It carries so much more. I mean, a canoe is great. You can go quite a long way in a canoe, but once you've got your rowers in and you've got all the water they need to go a long distance, there's very little room for anything else. Once you've got sailing ships, you can bring metals from one end.
And bronze was a massive change.
Huge change. So bronze makes a really, it's an integral part of the story of the integration of Europe into the rest of the world, because bronze, you need copper and tin. Copper's fine, there's lots of places you can get copper, not everywhere, but it's not so hard to get hold of. Tin is incredibly rare. It comes from, you can get it in Britain, you can get it in Afghanistan, and very few places in between, at least in the Bronze Age. And so being able to travel long distances and bring heavy metal back to the centre of the world, which is the time, the Levant, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and so on, makes a huge difference.
But of course, you know, as you said, that the Victorians, you know, were selling the wrong story because it suited them. You know, we were in the middle of empire, and you know, this was supposedly the height of civilization in the West, but actually, alphabet came from the Levant.
The alphabet came from the Levant, and of course, this is the thing, when people tell these stories about Western civilization in the 19th century, when they're inventing the whole idea of civilizations for the first time, but this kind of information that we have in the Greek authors, that the alphabet that we use in Europe today comes from the Levant, that even the Greeks called alphabetic letters Phoenicians. But the story that even the Greek authors didn't know is that actually the alphabet was invented by Levantine people. It's invented to write down Levantine languages, the kind of languages that become Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, Phoenician, and so on. But it's actually invented in Egypt. It's invented by guest workers and travellers from the Levant who are in Egypt, and at home they've had no reason to write their own language down. You know, the languages of state there are the great imperial languages, Akkadian, Egyptian, and so on. The local languages are spoken languages. It's only when they go abroad that they actually, for the first time, have a reason to write things down for each other and for their gods, I think probably even more importantly, send messages in their own languages. And they also, for the first time, have a new technology around them that they can use. So all the letters of the alphabet, the original alphabet, come from Egyptian hieroglyphs. They can't be Egyptian
because the appropriate because they don't know what their language might look like.
No, exactly. So they borrow these symbols. They have them upside down, back to front, and so on. They clearly are not actually reading the hieroglyphs, but they're using them.
Amber beads.
Right, amber beads are completely wonderful. So amber is a magic material. Amber is...
And it's actually seen as magical material as well.
It is seen as... because it is shiny, it's warm. If you burn it, it produces a perfume. If you rub it, it produces static. It floats on water, even though it's quite heavy. It's the most extraordinary thing. It's also incredibly rare. It only comes from Scandinavia and around the Baltic, some parts of Denmark and so on. And so everyone always wants amber. And you can trace amber beads. Baltic to Britain on canoes, and then it's coming back into Europe, down European rivers, all the way to Greece, and then it's coming into these graves. But what I really love is that the same, obviously, only very wealthy people get to have amber in their graves, but they also, at the same graves, will have things like carnelian from India and so on. People love the idea of things from far away. And it's the opposite of what I call the civilizational thinking of the 19th century. That these ancient people, we have no writings from this time, nothing, only accounts and so on, nothing we can read. We have to imagine their thought worlds from the things they used and possessed and buried with each other.
But then you've got, you talk about peripheral areas and marginal empires, if there's such a thing as a marginal empire, but Ugaritic, for example, that writing system came from, tell me about that Ugaritic writing system.
So Ugarit is this fascinating port. It's been almost forgotten now because it was so small, but it was a port on the coast of modern Syria. It was sort of in the shadow of the big empires, the Hittite Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Egyptian Empire, and so on. And at any one time, it was sort of formally subject to one of them. But it had a great deal of power of its own because it was on the 4 different trades. So you'd have sailors coming up and down the coast. You'd also have sailors going west to Cyprus. You'd have donkeys going east to the Euphrates and Babylonia beyond. It was an incredible crossroads of trade, which meant that it was very wealthy, it could exercise quite a lot of independent power. It also had a huge number of travellers, migrants, traders there, a lot of information and ideas. And what they do is they invent whole new ways of being. They invent their own alphabet. Yeah. They use it for state matters, which has never happened before. And they also invent this literature to go with it.
So let's talk a little bit about storytelling, because I think that for all of you it's about storytelling. But you know, the oral traditions of the world, look at Gilgamesh. I want to bring in the others here, but just look at Gilgamesh and explain how close that is to other stories that have been told.
Oh, well, Gilgamesh is a wonderful example of how stories can be told in one part of the world for thousands of years. So Gilgamesh is a story that develops over 1,000, 1,500 years in Babylonia. And it's very popular because it's a wonderful epic of this king and his friend Enkidu and the adventures they go on, the trouble they get into, and so on. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story. And it's told all across the Eastern Mediterranean and far beyond. And then hundreds of years later again, you get the Homeric epics of Greece, which draw extremely dramatically on these stories. The story of Achilles and Patroclus, in many ways, is very like the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, down to specific scenes, down to the way that the heroes react to their friends' deaths and so on. It's really very close. But I have to say, one of the most interesting things is that this is not recognised by Greek authors. They don't know they're doing it.
Yeah, but to be fair, they don't know they're doing it. And I'm going to bring you in, Christopher, in a moment, but Carolina, the Victorians like to present the picture of the purity of the Greek and Roman civilization. Well, that had been used to Romans themselves, because of course at its peak, the empire encompassed 1/5 of the world's population, so of course it was multicultural.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're absolutely right about the Victorians, and you know they did it with Roman material all the time, and you know a perfect example actually from the exhibition is the tombstone of Regina, a very famous tombstone mentioned in Joe's book as well, which is a woman. She's a Catabaluni, so she's a Briton originally, and she becomes the concubine, so you know enslaved woman of a Roman soldier called Barites, who comes from Palmyra, modern-day Syria, and they end up on Hadrian's Wall, where she eventually passes away. She's freed by him, and he marries her, and then he buries her, and she's got a beautiful tombstone, a Latin inscription, but then also an inscription in Aramaic, which would have been his language. But when the Victorians discovered this tombstone, the narrative around it was very much the story of this beautiful Briton who had seduced the mighty Barites, the great Roman soldier, and it was this fantastic love story, and of course because it's a love story and it was the Victorian era, she had to be beautiful. It was a Roman classical story, so of course she had to be beautiful, and he had to be brave. But the reality is that we don't know her perspective on anything. She was his concubine. She didn't have a choice in certainly the beginning of their encounter and their eventual relationship. We try to present that in that way in the exhibition to kind of try and understand where that narrative has come from and where we perceive it now.
Untangling the narrative, storytelling, of course, often is an appropriatory tool.
I think if you look back to 5th century BCE with Greek-speaking authors finding out about India, some of the stories that they come across, this strange mix of rumour, I think, and misunderstanding, which is part of the fun, I think, of the thrill of discovery. So you can find authors imagining that in India there are these people who have only one leg, but they have a foot on the end of that leg so big that at noon they can lie back and use it as a sunshade, or giant ants the size of dogs who dig up gold dust in the desert and you can then race in on the back of a camel and pick it up. So I think there's a taste for a tall tale amongst the ancient Greeks when it comes to India, but also trouble in telling fact from fiction. So I'm thinking of one author in particular, Ctesias. He claims that there are these monstrous creatures that you can ride around on the back of, uprooting trees and knocking down city walls, and also birds with crimson faces will speak Greek to you if you teach them. And all his contemporaries are saying,
fairy stories.
Exactly, that you're a filthy liar, basically. And then elephants.
Yeah, elephants. Alexander, who knew? I mean, that was a complete. I mean, that's how things change, isn't it? How things move forward. Ideas come. Alexander needs elephants. He learned that from other people.
Exactly, and the story of elephants is so brilliant.
Yes.
It's one of the wonderful things in Christopher's book. The storytelling, you have these elephants who kind of seem like fantastical characters, and there's in the Greek stories, they're great enemies of these manticores, who are these kind of lions with human faces and serpent tails. And I just imagine these the poor Greek soldiers kind of coming across these elephants and going, oh my goodness, they're actually real. Oh no, maybe the manticores are real as well.
Carolina, you wanted to come in.
Well, actually, in the exhibition, we did have we've got this lovely little figurine that's from the British Museum, and it's always been interpreted as a sort of Numidian soldier. But he's a rider, and he's missing part of what he would have been riding, which was interpreted as a horse before, but actually, because of the wide spread of his legs, we now believe he might have been riding an elephant, actually. So, for the Romans, there was this sense of sort of foreignness to have elephants being used in foreign armies as well.
Josephine, you also highlight in the book, and the book is a call to arms, you highlight the importance of the genome revolution. A lot of this stuff now is indisputable, I should say.
No, I mean, that's right. It's always hard to interpret, but it is indisputable. I think this is one of the real challenges for classicists in the world today, one of many. But one of them is that kind of the genome revolution is coming to get us. For a long time, the stories, even once aDNA, which is only a story of the last 20 years, when aDNA can actually be read itself, you don't have to kind of extrapolate backwards from modern populations. You can actually look at the human remains from antiquity and find out about people's heritage, families, and so on, all sorts of other things about them as well. But for a long time, that was stories about early humans. And then it gradually came forward, and more recent people were being investigated. And now it's really hitting the first millennium BC. This is the classical period. And we're suddenly finding out so much about this period that for hundreds of years, people have studied through the texts and the artifacts. And now we can actually study it through the people themselves. And that's an enormous thing. It's wonderful, but it's also hugely challenging. How do we interpret things? How do we learn to speak to scientists in such a way that we can actually put our heads together and understand what's really going on here?
Well, let's turn now to Legion, Life in the Roman Army, Carolina Rangel de Lima's brilliant co-curated exhibition. What you were showing was the quotidian lives of soldiers, but in telling that, you told a huge story about how the world operated, in the sense that, you had 60 million people at Augustus, first emperors, under the control of the Roman Empire, but with so few soldiers. And that was appropriation, wasn't it, of people locally, and so therefore you have, what I thought was wonderful with the exhibition is you've got Syrian soldiers, well, I would call them Syrian soldiers, Germans, even the odd British soldier.
Yes, it was one of the most difficult things in the exhibition was to tell these huge stories and cover these huge themes, but grounding it in the more personal objects and naming people where we could. But in some respects, the Roman archaeology lends itself to that, as hopefully you'll have seen in the exhibition. But we've got, kind of going through the narrative, we've got a character, Claudius Terentianus, who's, I say a character, he was a real soldier who's let his home survive. Yeah. And we know that he lives until retirement. So we decided very early on that we'd make him kind of our sort of spine of the exhibition. And he's a citizen soldier from Egypt. And so we also kind of start the exhibition in Egypt. And we try to have people travel through the empire, through the objects, to really give them that sense of scope. And wherever we can, we try to bring in objects that showed the complexity of those stories. And Regina, which I just talked about, is a perfect example. But we've got other simple things like letters and inscriptions. We've got Nectavelius, who is it's an inscription from the National Museum of Scotland, and so he was serving on the Antonine Wall, and he was a Brigantian soldier, so northern British, you'd expect, but he talks about serving in a cohort of Thracians. So we know there were Thracians living up there.
Let's just stick though with Terentianus, because Terentianus writes these letters and he's looking for things, he's looking for some money from his family, he needs to get better himself, he needs help. Yes. It's extraordinary that you've got this group of letters.
Yeah, it was amazing, and that was one of the first things when we were talking about his letters in the early meetings around the exhibition and shaping the narrative. We just knew that we wanted to ground it in his story, and he's just such a character as well. That's what we really felt from the letters, and what hopefully visitors feel. And we've got someone reading out excerpts from his letters to give more of that, sense of person and individuality. But he tries to join the legions. He's a citizen, as I said, an Egyptian citizen. And as a citizen, you could join the legions. If you were not a citizen, you'd become an auxiliary, which meant worse pay and other benefit, other disadvantages we can speak of. But he can't, because he doesn't have a good enough letter of recommendation. So a reminder that actually all soldiers needed a letter of recommendation as well to join. And then from then on, we get a sort of sequence of letters of him writing to his father or godfather. The relationship is a bit unclear, but he asks for things all the time. And he asks for spears, and he asks for a battle sword, and he talks about putting down a revolt in Alexandria, which sounds like something a soldier would do and great danger. But then he equally talks about getting food poisoning or forgetting his trousers, and it's just trying to mix that blend of the stories you expect about soldiers and the things that remind you that they were just people.
We should say that you're joining us remotely this morning. When I say remotely, from somewhere in London. But what's great as well is the everyday objects. Now, you'd set out with an idea of what you thought you might find, but then you found different stuff. So you thought, particularly because you're passionate about lamps and lighting, but actually you found something completely different.
Yes, so it was one of the things that we wanted was to bring a different kind of exhibition, because we wanted to showcase this reality. We didn't want the sort of standard exhibition you might expect at the British Museum, which is fantastic, of these incredible objects that are really rare and only used by the elite. And we do have some of those as well. We've got the only complete Roman shield and the horse arm and all these beautiful objects. But what we really wanted was to mix those spectacular objects with a little dose of reality. So I'll give you a good example. I think we've got a beautiful bust of the Empress Julia Domna, who travelled with her husband Septimius Severus, was a big presence in the Roman military, and she has her distinctive hairstyle. It's a beautiful marble bust, and her hairstyle was a wig, looks a bit like a Roman military helmet. We think that's relevant, and it shows her hair poking out. So she's kind of obviously in this sculpture showing that she's wearing a wig. Absolutely beautiful piece of classical sculpture. But one of the reasons that it's been suggested she perhaps wore a wig was because she had to prop her hair like the soldiers because of getting nicks and, hygienic reasons. So the other objects that we've got in the exhibition are nick combs from Vinzlanda's fort up on Hadrian's Wall. And, it's mixing that sort of, imperial sculpture and portraiture showing this classical, perfect sense that is not the reality with, this dose of reality.
Yes, and the dose of reality extends to the fact that you have got the most extraordinary, the first letter by a woman in Britain. You have got her birthday party invitation, the birthday party invitation at Claudia Severa. Tell us about Claudia Severa.
So Claudia Severa was the wife of a commander of a fort that was nearby Vinzlanda, and what this letter is she's inviting the wife of the commander at Vinzlanda, Flavia Cerealis. She's inviting his wife, Sulpicia Lepidina, to her birthday party, which is just so extraordinary. And it's important to say that it is, as you say, the earliest known female handwriting. Of course, women may have written before, but we wouldn't have had their names. We may have evidence of it in museums now, but we don't know. But this is so extraordinary because it's signed by her. So we know it's actually written in two hands. One hand is probably a professional scribe who's writing her invitation for her, but then she signs it off. She says something sort of translated vaguely to, I shall expect you, sister, farewell, sister, my dearest soul, as I hope to prosper and hail. And she writes that in her own hand, so this second hand to her friend. But again, it's one of those objects that really resonates with people because everyone understands the concept of a birthday party, but almost no one would apply it to the Roman period. But of course, they were all having their own engagements.
And I want to come on to talking about assimilating and copying enemy artifacts. But before I do that, we have to talk about one game that was in incredible condition, and that's the Dice Tower.
Yes, actually one of my favourite objects in the exhibition, and it comes from the frontier in Germany, so from nearby Bonn in Germany, and it's this incredible dice tower, which is exactly what it sounds like, a tower made of bronze, where you would put dice in the top. Now the reason this is important is there's a series of layers on the inside that make the die roll when you put it in, so it actually prevents cheating. And the Romans were big gamblers and gamers, but they also, we do find weighted dice, so we know that they were also cheaters. And it's a remarkable object in a military context as well, because it actually has an inscription that says, Pictos victos hostes deleta utere securiter, which means the Picts have been defeated, all hostiles have been destroyed, and now play me in safety or use me in safety.
Also, what I think when you look at the contributions to the exhibition, what I love is you've got a lot from regional museums, and particularly Carlisle. Well, of course, because they got kind of stuck there, didn't they, for a longer time? So presumably there was more stuff lying around in the ground.
Yeah, exactly. These frontier forts have just so much material, and if you visit Hadrian's Wall and you go to Carlisle and Tully House Museum, or indeed to Vinzland or any of the museums up along the Hadrian or the Antonine Wall, you'll see all this material, but it doesn't normally make it into these major exhibitions. I mean, yes, some of the most extraordinary material, like Regina and all of that,
but the everyday
these
stuff.
simple stories. Absolutely, and one of the things you mentioned, of course, my love of lamps is true. It's an object type that I'm very attached to, and I wanted to bring them into the exhibition. But actually, when I went to visit these frontier forts, you just noticed that it was not a common object that soldiers had, and so we, in an attempt to not distort that reality, we really try to focus on objects that do come up,
like nick combs.
Like nick combs, which are found very frequently.
But to Joe's book, in a sense, a nod to Joe's book now, to talk about the fact of appropriation. So, for example, the Dragon Standard, which essentially was Iranian.
Yes, we've actually got two objects in the exhibition that refer to these Draconari and sort of Sarmatian, Sassanian, Iranian forces that used to be the enemies of the Romans, and that is a horse horse armor, which is exactly what it sounds like, armor to cover a horse, and it's completely scaled. And then we've got this incredible object, which is a dragon head standard. So it would have sat on, much like any kind of Roman standard, a long pole, but it's quite unique in that it's the head of a dragon in bronze. It's hollow and has an opening at the end where a windsock would have been attached. And when you ride on a horse, because they were carried standards that were carried by horsemen or cavalrymen, it actually, the wind blowing through it makes this growling sound. It's really unique. And the Romans, these Eastern forces were depicted very commonly as the enemies of the Romans, particularly in the early 2nd century on Trajan's column, and these objects were actually Roman. So eventually they did incorporate into the Roman forces themselves. So actually, in terms of the Cataphact armor, we don't actually know if it was used against the Romans or by the Romans, that particular armor.
So Josephine, looking at this exhibition and reading in conjunction with your book, you get this reinforced idea that actually we're talking about civilizations.
Well, civilizations, but also that what I want to suggest is that what we should look at is the connections more than the civilizations. That's where the action really is. And one of the things that's just fascinating and really came out over and over again in the exhibition is the way that people are constantly appropriating other people's culture, but they never just copy it. There's a great fear at the moment of sort of cultural replacement, but that never actually happens. It's always different somehow.
Christopher, for you looking at this exhibition, what was your favourite?
I think I really enjoyed in particular that sandstone gaming board, Caroline, with the little glass counters on the top of it. You just get those imperfectly marked out shapes, the kind of crossword puzzle type design on top. You just get